My name is Lee Moore. This is the Chinese Literature Podcast. I'm back after a little bit of a hiatus. I had a break. We did the interview with Susan Wan Dowling, which was awesome, but I tried to time it to when my book was coming out, which meant it came out later than I wanted to. By the time that I got around to actually thinking about doing another podcast, it was already time for me to go on a vacation, which brings me to another point. The book is out. If you want, you can go to the book's website, chinasbackstory.com. And there are multiple ways for you to buy it. Some people have been asking me, do I want you to buy it through my publisher's site or is Amazon okay? My publisher and I certainly would prefer you buy it through our site, but I totally understand folks buy through Amazon. If you do buy through Amazon, definitely leave a review. Those reviews help drive the algorithms that sell books on Amazon. That's enough for self-promotion. I have wanted to do a short series on Tang poetry for a while. The podcast did it before, back in the day when Rob Moore was sitting beside me, but it's been a long time. So I wanted to do a 3-part series that would bring to light something that this podcast has not really talked about. I want to do a short series on Tang poetry where I juxtapose the 3 great poets of the Tang dynasty, Li Bai, Du Fu, and Wang. We'll do an episode on each of them. I don't know how much compare and contrast I'm going to do in each of these episodes. By putting them together, I guess I'm inherently comparing them, but I don't know how far that will go. So first off, as we get into this episode, I should point something out to y'all that I think is not really apparent to a lot of folks who know Tang poetry has these 3 dudes, Li Bai, Du Fu, and Wang, but don't really know anything else about Tang poetry. So Tang poetry is different from all other poetic periods in China. In the Song and all other dynasties, poetry is divided up into 3 chronological periods. You usually have early, middle, and late. And that's it. That's how the poetic schema is divided. They lay it out chronologically in the dynasty. Early, first 100 so years, middle, second 100 or so years, late, last 100 or so years. With the Tang, and only with the Tang, there's actually another period. It's called High Tang, Sheng Tang, and it's right there in between the early Tang and the middle Tang. This is the reign of Emperor Xuanzang, who reigned from 12 to 756. His reign is considered the height of really China and Chinese culture, particularly Chinese poetry. If you were a school kid in China today, you are memorizing poems that were written in this period, even today, even 1,500 years later. Of course, Emperor Xuanzong and his antics contributed to the downfall of the Tang, where the Tang didn't end, but it became extremely weak and limped on for another 150 years. But that's a totally different kettle of fish that we're not going to get into today. The point of this discussion of the High Tang is to point out that Chinese folks look at Tang poetry differently. It's marked by a greatness that, according to a lot of Chinese people, no other poetic age can match. I actually disagree with that. I think Song Dynasty poetry is just as good as Tang poetry at its best, but that's another kettle of fish. Wow, here I am repeating myself. Okay, so here in this series on the podcast, we're going to look back at that period. We're looking back at the 3 highest of the High Tang poets, Li Bai, Du Fu, and Wang. Today we're going to look at Li Bai. This is not the first time in the podcast that we've done an episode on Li Bai, but it is the first time we're going to discuss a particular aspect of his biography that we haven't really discussed on the podcast, and that's Li Bai's relationship with the West. But it's not the West that you're thinking about. What we are talking about today is the Western regions beyond China proper that China sometimes colonized, sometimes fantasized about, but always the West, that is modern-day Xinjiang and the stands, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. This area, China had a long relationship with it, and Li Bai was an important part of that relationship. So there is a debate. Who is the greatest Chinese poet? Is it Du Fu or is it Li Bai? In that interview with Susan Wan Dowling, she said, no one stands up to Du Fu, but there are other folks who have other opinions on that. I actually disagree with Susan respectfully, even though she's an awesome translator. I actually think Li Bai is better. And although Du Fu is If you were to go into a Chinese university today and ask Du Fu or Li Bai who's the best, I think most people in the university would say Du Fu is the greatest Chinese poet ever. But he's more respected and less loved. When you have the average Chinese person talking about poetry, it's Li Bai, not Du Fu, who they usually quote. Li Bai is the most commonly memorized poet by school children in China today. Literary scholars probably like more, but lots of literary scholars actually think Li Bai is the best. Friend of the podcast, Steve Durant, was a professor at the University of Oregon. He's one of the foremost experts on Sima Qian and the Shiji. When he was studying at the University of Washington in the 1960s and 1970s, he had a professor, Helmut Wilhelm, and he told this to his Chinese literature class. John Wu, the author of, and I'm quoting the story from an email he wrote me, John Wu, the author of the very fine 4 Seasons of Tang Poetry, once told me here being Helmut Wilhelm, quote, "Anybody who thinks Li Bai is a greater poet than Du Fu is not worth his weight in salt," end quote. At this point, Wilhelm took a deep draw of his ever-present cigarette, held the smoke in for what seemed like an impossibly long period, and then poured a billow of smoke into the air above our heads, stared us straight in the eye, and said, the cigarette extended towards us in his hand, quote, "So, my dear students, I, your teacher, am not worth my weight in salt," end quote. All of that's to say, even literary scholars have this debate, and though Du Fu comes out on top more often than not in these academic spheres, still, lots of academics love Li Bai. And I'm going to be honest, I personally am not worth my weight in salt either. I am a much bigger fan of Li Bai than Du Fu. Du Fu is interesting as a historical poet. I just don't personally see where his claim to greatness comes from, especially if we think of poetry as being this most linguistic of arts. I think Li Bai is just much more interesting linguistically. Another thing about Li Bai is just much easier to translate. And I mean that not just in terms of the language that he uses, although I think it's more translatable, but also Li Bai is easier to translate in terms of relevance. Du Fu's poems are often weighty and have these really complicated arguments about what's happening in Chinese history. Li Bai is much easier to parse on a personal level. You don't need to know that much about Chinese history to read a lot of Li Bai's poems. Some of them you do, but a lot of them, they're just about drinking. And honestly, Li Bai is at his best when he is boozing it up. The tale, almost certainly not true, but I'm going to tell it anyways. The tale is that Li Bai died while drinking in a boat. He was drunk. He tried to reach for the reflection of the moon in the Yangtze River. He leaned over the boat he was in, and he fell in and drowned. That's almost certainly not true, but it's still a common tale told about Li Bai. The thing is, though, Du Fu actually wrote some good drinking poetry, and Li Bai wrote some very historically informed poetry about power in the Tang dynasty. So caricatures aside, these poets are both really great, but I think Li Bai is better. One, section of Li Bai's poetry that is most connected to these discussions of history is his poetry about China's Wild West. I mentioned this before, that vast region called the Xiyu, the Western Districts. This region encompasses Xinjiang in today's PRC, but it also includes much of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and it also includes Persia and anything beyond that, depending on the source. Some people use the word Xiyu when writing in Chinese to mean farther away. Some people have a more compact definition, but it's basically the Xinjiang and beyond. Li Bai has a long and strange relationship with the Xiyu, with China's West. And this sounds kind of weird, but Li Bai might have actually Li Bai probably was born in the West. That's right. A man many believe to be the greatest Chinese poet ever may not have even been Chinese. We don't know much about Li Bai's family. They lived in the boonies, and the accounts that we have of his family today probably came from Li Bai himself. And as he is moving from the boonies in Sichuan to the capital, which is Chang'an, or approximately modern-day Xi'an, and becoming a Tang poetry superstar, he's giving these biographies, and we have to rely on those because that's all we have. One of the stories we have about Li Bai's ancestors is that his Chinese family was quote unquote ethnically Chinese, whatever that means in this period. And they had long ago been banished to Central Asia and stripped of their last name, that is the surname Li. And only recently had they come out of disgrace and been able to return to China. And when they came back, they returned to using their last name, Li. This story is almost certainly made up. And just so y'all know, my source for this is Stephen Owen's book, The Great Age of Chinese Poetry. This is the classic work on the subject. So this story about Li Bai's family having been banished to Central Asia and stripped of their last name is almost certainly made up. What the truth probably is, and we'll never actually know, is that the truth is probably that Li Bai was ethnically not Han Chinese, or what we would call today Han Chinese. They didn't actually use the term Han Chinese, really. Instead, Li Bai probably comes from a family of merchants from Central Asia. He's probably ethnically either Turkic or Sogdian. When you think of Turkish, you're probably thinking of that country that's got a toehold in Europe and the rest of it's in Anatolia. But Turks start out first in what is today Mongolia, and they migrate slowly from east to west, eventually winding up on Europe's doorstep. But even today, there are a large number of Turks in Asia. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, all are Turkic countries. And even Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, are Turks. They speak a Turkic language. Sogdian is the other possibility of what Li Bai's ethnicity is. Those are just folks who speak an Iranian language. Sogdians were, for a while, very big in terms of the Silk Road trade. So Li Bai was probably from a merchant family. He was probably ethnically Turkic or Sogdian. And let me just throw in a wrench here. It's entirely possible that Li Bai might have actually been, hang on, I'm going to say it, Jewish. Now, this is purely speculation. There's no evidence to support that Li Bai was Jewish, but there were lots of Jews at the time working as merchants, moving stuff around Central Asia into China. He totally could have been one of those people. We don't have any evidence of that. We don't really know ethnically what he was, other than that he's probably from merchant family in Central Asia, born in what is modern-day Kyrgyzstan, just about 30-ish miles from the capital of Bishkek. So my point is not that he was a Jew or a Sogdian or a Turk. My point is actually that we just don't know what he was, but he was from modern-day Kyrgyzstan. And we know that the story that he told as cover probably wasn't true, and that he probably was not ethnically Chinese, at least in the way that we think of ethnic groups today. So Li Bai's dad moves from Central Asia to Sichuan, probably working as a merchant, carries little Li Bai with him, settles there in Sichuan. Li Bai becomes educated in Chinese and Chinese poetry, becomes a Tang Dynasty poetry superstar. Today we have about 1,000 poems by Li Bai, but tons of them were lost, so we have no clue how many he actually wrote. A lot of these poems were about China's west, and here is one of the poems that Li Bai wrote touching on the Xiyu, on the western regions. And it's called Guanshan Yue. That's moon above the mountain pass. Here's my translation. The bright moon comes out from behind the Tian Shan mountains, amongst a vast sea of clouds. The faraway wind, tens of thousands of miles, blows out through the pass at Jade Gate. The Han Chinese descend the Baideng Road. The barbarian observes a bay on the green sea. Since ancient times, this ground has been fought over, not seen as whether people return from those battles. The border guard watches the border city. He thinks about returning home, and his face is greatly saddened. Tonight, in the bedroom where the soldier's wife is, her sighs will never stop. So here we see Li Bai talking about the emotional toll that China's colonization of the Xiyu, of these western regions, takes on Chinese folks. There is that setup, and it makes it clear that this is not a Chinese space. The moon pops out from behind the Tian Shan Mountains, and the Tian Shan Mountains are the mountain range that divides Xinjiang, modern-day Xinjiang, into north and south, and those mountains continue straight on into Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. The Jade Gate, this is a spot in Gansu. Today there's a town there called Jade Gate, Yumen. But this spot has long been imagined by Chinese poets as the point where you go from being in China proper to the world of the barbarians. And what's up with that reference to Baideng Road? Where is Baideng Road? Baideng Road is actually nowhere near the western regions or Xinjiang. It's actually a road near modern day Datong, which is in the north of Shanxi, which those of y'all who know China, it's like the edge of the China steppe borderlands. It's very close to Inner Mongolia. It's right there on the border between the provinces of Inner Mongolia and Shanxi. Like I said, it's not anywhere near Xinjiang or the Xiyu, but this road is where, in the middle of the first Han dynasty, battles between these barbarians, the kind of paradigmatic barbarians, the Xiongnu, and the first Han emperor happened. This Han emperor, he was almost captured by the Xiongnu in 200 BC. So Baideng Road is less a place on the map. It is a real place, but it's not being used here as a place on the map. Because today, if you went there, actually in the Tang Dynasty, if you went there, it'd probably be fairly what we think of as ethnically Han Chinese. But Li Bai is putting it into this poem to remind us, his readers, of this long history of tensions between the Chinese and the barbarians. This is ancient history. Remember, Li Bai is writing 9.5 centuries after the Han emperor was almost captured at Baideng Road. But he's trying to put this poem into the context of us versus the barbarians. In the next line, it does the same thing. It just says the barbarians are there looking at the Green Sea. Unlike the Baideng reference, there's nothing historical about this reference. It's just a barbarian there looking at Green Sea. Here, Green Sea, I translated it as Green Sea, but it's actually Qinghai, the giant inland sea called Kokonor in the province of Qinghai, which the province gets its name from the lake. It's today mostly a Tibetan region. So again, there's this sense of this is an area that's kind of on the borderlands where China meets the barbarian world. That is the first half of the poem. It's just setting the scene. Nothing really happens in the first half. In terms of plot, and I do think poems have plots. There's a debate, but I'm going to say it. Poems have plots. Nothing really happens in the plot of this first half of the poem. The moon comes out. The wind blows through the Jade Gate. A Han Chinese dude gets onto Baideng Road. A barbarian looks over Qinghai Lake. Not really much is happening in terms of plot. The first half is all about establishing the foreignness of the poem's setting. It's only in the second half, once the scene is established, once the foreign mood is set, that we really get into the meat of the poem. The tension there, this is actually a love story. Since ancient times, this ground has been fought over. Some people don't return from that fighting. Some people die there. And then we get what this poem is really about, that love story. The soldier, I guess you could call him the main character in this poem. If this poem has a main character, really the main character is the foreignness of the poem. But we have the soldier, this border guard. He's there watching over the border region. But he is thinking about home, somewhere he can't go. He has to stay here in this borderland between the Chinese and barbarian world. But he's thinking about home. He's thinking about returning home to his normal family life and having a sexual relationship with his wife, who he's separated from by thousands of miles, and he's consumed by the sadness. At the same time, the last two lines tell us that the wife is also on the other side. She is there in the Chinese world, deep in the Chinese world, in the bedroom where she and the border guard once lived. And she is imagining at this very moment him returning home and making love to her. She's in that bedroom. We're told that the sighs will never stop. It's clear what's going on here. There's clear sexual overtones in this, something that would never be directly said in most Chinese poems. There are some that will say it directly, but in this kind of poem, that hint is enough to set off the alarm bells. This poem is about two people who love each other and really want to get it on. I think this poem is interesting because it's clearly a critique of the militaristic policies of the dynasty. They are waging these colonial wars, pushing deeper into Central Asia. And we're asked to think about the harm that this does to those Chinese families who are involved in the imperialistic adventures. And yet at the same time, is probably from these barbarian areas. I'm not really sure what to make of it. I think there's this tension. Li Bai himself is certainly not a pacifist. He has blood-curdling poetry, but there is a clear critique of the militaristic policies of imperialist here. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there. I will put this poem and the translation of it on the website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. Of course, you can go there and find links to where you can purchase my book, China's Backstory, The History Beijing Doesn't Want You to Read. I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.